A quiet break turns tumultuous. The morning air was crisp, carrying a hint of rain that never seemed to fall. James Parker, a 38-year-old Detroit firefighter, adjusted his cap as he stepped onto the sidewalk outside his modest apartment. His broad shoulders stretched the seams of his uniform shirt. Though he wasn't on duty, today was his day off, an increasingly rare luxury. He had promised himself he'd enjoy it. James wasn't just any firefighter. He was a hero to his community. Over 12 years of service had made him a familiar face in the bustling neighborhoods of Detroit, where residents often greeted him with warm smiles or grateful handshakes. Yet even heroes deserved a day of rest. He decided to treat himself to breakfast at a small diner he'd been meaning to visit for months. The sign read Bella's Cafe, a cozy establishment tucked between a laundromat and a corner store. It had a reputation for homemade biscuits and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon welcomed him. He scanned the room, noting the eclectic mix of patrons, an elderly couple sharing pancakes, a mother calming her fussy toddler, and a few individuals hunched over newspapers. It was unassuming, just as he liked it. James approached the counter where a waitress with curly red hair and a kind smile greeted him. Her name tag read Maggie. "Morning, Honorable. What'll it be?" she asked, her warm tone matching the atmosphere. "Morning, Maggie. I'll take the big breakfast platter with extra eggs and a black coffee," James replied with a smile that made Maggie pause for just a moment. She scribbled his order and assured him it would be out shortly. He took a seat by the window, appreciating the rare moment of quiet as he looked out onto the street. A light drizzle began to patter against the glass, distorting the view of passersby. As he waited, the door jingled again, and a younger man walked in, a tall, wiry figure dressed in jeans and a dark hoodie. James's firefighter instincts tingled. The man wasn't a regular. He had the jittery energy of someone who didn't want to be noticed, yet couldn't help but draw attention. "Coffee. Black. Now," the man muttered, avoiding eye contact with Maggie as he handed over a crumpled bill. Maggie hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the coffee pot. James's sharp eyes noted her discomfort and the man's darting glances at the other patrons. The tension broke when a commanding voice echoed from behind the counter. "Maggie, step away. I'll handle this." James turned to see the manager, a burly man in his mid-50s with a thick salt and pepper beard. His name tag read Bert. He strode toward the counter, his gaze locked on the young man like a hawk. Bert's face, lined with years of stern authority, showed clear disdain. "We don't serve troublemakers here," Bert said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm not causing trouble," the man replied, his voice wavering. "I just want my coffee. And I just want my customers to feel safe," Bert shot back. "Now get out." The young man clenched his fists, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. James stood, his chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Hold on, Bert," James said, stepping between the manager and the man. "This guy just wants a coffee. Let's not make this more than it needs to be." Bert's eyes flicked to James, his expression hardening. "And who are you to tell me how to run my business?" "Just a customer," James said evenly, "but one who knows a thing or two about diffusing tense situations." The young man looked at James, his gaze softening as if he recognized a kindred spirit. James saw it too, the quiet desperation in the man's eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had been beaten down by life. "Let me pay for his coffee," James offered, pulling a few bills from his wallet. Bert sneered. "It's not about the money. People like him are the problem in this city." James's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "And people like you, with your assumptions, aren't helping." The room went silent, the quiet hum of the diner replaced by the heavy weight of the confrontation. Bert's face reddened, but before he could respond, the young man turned on his heel and walked out the door, the jingling bell a hollow echo of the tension left behind. James sighed, pocketed his money, and returned to his seat. Maggie brought his breakfast a few moments later, her hands still shaking. "I'm sorry about that," she whispered. "Bert's not always like this, but lately." James raised an eyebrow. "Lately? What?" Maggie glanced over her shoulder to ensure Bert was out of earshot. "He's been different. Angrier, quick to judge. And it's not just today. Something's going on." James nodded, filing the information away. "Thanks, Maggie. And hey, don't let anyone bully you, okay? You're better than that." She smiled faintly and walked away. James ate in silence, his appetite diminished by the lingering tension. Outside, the rain had picked up, washing the streets clean as if trying to erase the morning's events. But for James, the moment lingered like a bad taste. Something about Bert, the young man, and Maggie's words gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a bad morning at a diner. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Ripples in still waters. James couldn't stop thinking about the scene at Bella's cafe. It lingered like a bitter aftertaste, making the rest of his day feel heavier. After breakfast, he decided to head to the local community center where he sometimes volunteered. He hoped a few hours of helping others might distract him from the uneasy feeling gnawing at his chest. The center was a safe haven for the neighborhood, a place where children played, seniors socialized, and those in need found support. As he stepped through the doors, the familiar hum of chatter and laughter greeted him. James exchanged nods and handshakes with a few familiar faces before making his way to the back office to check in with the director, Miss Ethel. Miss Ethel was a fixture in the community, her presence as constant as the sunrise. A petite woman with a crown of silver hair and a voice that could silence a room. She was both a mother and a disciplinarian to everyone who walked through the center's doors. "James," she said warmly, looking up from her desk, "I was hoping you'd stop by. We got a shipment of supplies that needs sorting. And," she paused, narrowing her eyes at him, "you look like you've got something on your mind. Spill it." James chuckled. "Is it that obvious? To me, it is. Sit down, son." He lowered himself into the chair across from her desk and recounted the events at Bella's cafe. The young man, Bert's hostility, and Maggie's nervous confession. Miss Ethel listened intently, her sharp eyes never leaving his face. "That Bert," she said when he finished, shaking her head. "He's always been a gruff one, but this sounds different. There's something brewing there." "I thought the same thing," James admitted, "but I don't know what. Maggie mentioned he's been acting angrier lately, like something's weighing on him." Miss Ethel leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. "You've got good instincts, James. If you think there's more to this, there probably is. But tread carefully. If Bert's dealing with something shady, you don't want to get caught in the middle of it without knowing what you're up against." James nodded, appreciating her wisdom. "Thanks, Miss Ethel. I'll keep my eyes open." After helping to unload and sort the supply shipment, James spent the afternoon playing basketball with a group of teenagers. The physical activity and the laughter of the kids provided a welcome distraction. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the unease returned. That evening, as James walked home, he passed by Bella's cafe. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the dark, casting an eerie glow on the wet pavement. Something compelled him to stop. The diner was closed, but a single light shone from the back office. Curiosity got the better of him. He crossed the street and approached the window, staying in the shadows. Through a gap in the blinds, he saw Bert hunched over a desk, a phone pressed to his ear. His body language screamed agitation, hands gesturing wildly, shoulders tense. James strained to hear, but the glass muffled the conversation. He caught snippets of words. "Not my problem. You deal with it. No, I told you I'm done." Bert slammed the phone down, rubbing his temples. For a moment, he sat motionless, then opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. He dumped its contents onto the desk, stacks of cash, and a slip of paper. Bert's lips moved as he read the note, his expression darkening. James's instincts flared. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal. But before he could process it further, a noise behind him made him spin around. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a wiry silhouette that sent a jolt of recognition through James. It was the young man from the diner. "What are you doing here?" the man demanded, his voice low but firm. James raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I could ask you the same thing." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between James and the cafe window. "You're not one of them, are you?" "One of who?" James asked, keeping his voice calm. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I saw what happened this morning, and something doesn't sit right with me." The man studied James for a long moment, then sighed. "You don't know what you've stumbled into. Bert, he's not just some grumpy diner owner. He's involved in something bigger, something dangerous." "What kind of dangerous?" James pressed, his firefighter instincts kicking in again. The man shook his head. "I can't say. But you need to be careful. They don't like people asking questions." "Who's they?" James asked, but the man was already backing away. "Stay out of it," he warned, "for your own good." Then he disappeared into the night. James stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Whatever Bert was involved in, it was enough to make people nervous, maybe even afraid. And now, James was part of it, whether he liked it or not. The next morning, James decided to dig deeper. He started by visiting a friend from his high school days, Malik, who worked as a private investigator. Malik's office was a cluttered space above a hardware store, filled with filing cabinets, old coffee mugs, and stacks of case files. "James Parker," Malik said, leaning back in his chair with a grin. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need a favor," James said, pulling up a chair. He explained everything. Bert's behavior, the young man's warning, and the scene he'd witnessed outside the diner. Malik listened without interrupting, his grin fading into a thoughtful frown. "You've got yourself a mystery, my friend. But mysteries cost time and money. Lucky for you, I owe you one." James smiled. Malik had a knack for getting to the bottom of things, and his loyalty was unmatched. "Start with Bert," James suggested. "I want to know who he's dealing with and why." "You got it," Malik said, already pulling up his computer. "But be careful, James. You're poking a hornet's nest here." As James left Malik's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the young man's warning was just the tip of the iceberg. Bert's diner was more than it appeared, and James was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory. The cracks began to show. Days passed, but the mystery around Bert and Bella's cafe only deepened. Malik worked tirelessly, digging through public records, surveillance footage, and his network of informants. James kept himself busy at the firehouse, but his mind never strayed far from the growing sense of unease that had taken root since the diner incident. On a chilly Wednesday evening, Malik called. "James," he said, his voice tense, "you'd better get down here. I've got something you need to see." James didn't waste a second. He grabbed his jacket and headed to Malik's office. The streets of Detroit were quiet, the city cloaked in the heavy stillness that often preceded a storm. By the time James arrived, Malik was pacing his office, his face tight with worry. "What's going on?" James asked, shutting the door behind him. Malik gestured to his computer screen. "I've been pulling threads on Bert and the diner. At first, it was all standard stuff, tax records, property deeds, supplier contracts. But then I started digging into his financials. James, the numbers don't add up." James leaned over the desk, studying the spreadsheets Malik had compiled. "What do you mean?" "I mean Bert's diner isn't making enough to support the kind of cash flow I'm seeing here," Malik explained, pointing to a series of highlighted entries. "Look at these deposits, large sums of money coming in from shell companies. And these outgoing payments, they're going to offshore accounts." James frowned. "So, Money laundering. That's what it looks like, Malik said. But there's more. I cross-referenced the company sending Bert money with other businesses in the area. Turns out, there's a pattern. Small, struggling businesses suddenly receive cash infusions, only to close down a few months later. And guess who buys them up cheap? James's stomach sank. Bert. Malik nodded grimly. Or more accurately, a holding company he's tied to. It's called Urban Revitalization Partners, but they're anything but. They're systematically driving out local businesses, gentrifying neighborhoods, and pushing residents out of the city. James rubbed his temples, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on him. So Bert's not just running a scam. He's part of a bigger operation. And it gets worse, Malik said, pulling up another file. I found a connection between Urban Revitalization Partners and a group of city officials. We're talking permits pushed through without oversight, zoning changes that conveniently align with their acquisitions. This isn't just corruption. It's a full-scale conspiracy. James sat back, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together. Bert's hostility, the nervous waitress, the young man's warning. It all pointed to something much larger and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. An unexpected ally. Later that night, James returned home, his thoughts still tangled in the web Malik had uncovered. As he stepped into his apartment, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello. Is this James Parker?" A woman's voice asked. It was soft, but carried an edge of urgency. "Who's asking?" James replied cautiously. "My name's Maria. I'm the sister of the man you met at the diner." James's heart skipped a beat. The young man. He never gave me his name. "It's Danny," Maria said. "And he's in trouble. I need your help." James's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of trouble? Maria hesitated. He found out something he wasn't supposed to. About Bert, about the people he's working with. They've been watching him, following him. He's gone into hiding, but he told me you might understand, that you might help. James's mind raced. Danny's warning replayed in his head. Stay out of it. For your own good. I'll do what I can, James said. But I need to know what Danny found. I don't have all the details, Maria admitted. But he mentioned a meeting, something happening soon. He said it could expose everything. James's pulse quickened. Where's this meeting? Maria hesitated again, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's at Bella's Cafe, late Friday night, after closing. The plan takes shape. The next morning, James met with Malik to share what Maria had told him. Malik's expression darkened as he listened. This is risky, James, Malik said. If we crash that meeting, we're walking straight into their den. We need to be prepared. I know, James replied. That's why I'm bringing you along. Malik laughed dryly. Oh no, I'm not built for fieldwork, my friend. I'm the guy behind the scenes. You're also the guy who knows how to gather evidence, James countered. We need proof, Malik. Something solid we can take to the authorities. Malik sighed, running a hand over his face. Fine, but if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. They spent the next 2 days planning. Malik secured a pair of hidden cameras and recording devices, while James brushed up on his old police training. They identified escape routes, contingency plans, and backup options in case things went sideways. As Friday night approached, the tension between them grew. They both knew the risks, but neither was willing to back down. The meeting. At 11:30 p.m. on Friday, James and Malik parked a few blocks away from Bella's Cafe. The diner was dark, except for the faint glow of light spilling from the back office. They approached cautiously, sticking to the shadows. Ready? James whispered, adjusting the earpiece connected to the hidden camera. As I'll ever be, Malik muttered, his voice shaky. They slipped around to the alley behind the diner, where a small window offered a view into the back room. James peered inside, his heart pounding. Bert sat at the head of a table, flanked by 3 men in expensive suits. One of them was speaking, his voice low but intense. James couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The tension in the room was palpable. Malik set up the recording equipment, his hands trembling slightly. "We've got one shot at this," he whispered. "Let's make it count." As they watched, Bert produced a thick envelope and handed it to one of the men. The man opened it, revealing a stack of cash and what appeared to be a list of names. James's blood ran cold. This is it. This is the evidence we need. But before he could signal Malik to move, the sound of a car door slamming nearby made them both freeze. Footsteps approached the alley, and a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "Who's there?" a voice barked. James's heart raced as he pressed himself against the wall. Malik looked at him, panic in his eyes. They had been spotted. The shadows close in. The flashlight beam grew closer, illuminating the damp pavement of the alley. James's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing for options. Next to him, Malik clutched the recording equipment, his face pale but determined. There was no time for second-guessing. "Stay quiet," James whispered, pressing himself against the wall. The footsteps slowed as the figure with the flashlight scanned the alley. A burly man stepped into view, his sharp eyes sweeping the darkness. He was armed, the bulge of a handgun visible beneath his jacket. James recognized him immediately, one of Bert's enforcers, a man he'd seen lurking in the diner during quieter hours. "Hey, I know someone's out here," the man barked, his voice echoing in the tight space. "Show yourself, or this gets ugly." James made a split-second decision. He motioned for Malik to stay hidden, then stepped out of the shadows, his hands raised. "Relax," James said, keeping his tone calm and even. "I was just passing through." The enforcer narrowed his eyes, the flashlight glaring in James's face. "This isn't the kind of alley people just pass through." "Who are you?" "Name's James," he said, sidestepping slightly to block the man's view of where Malik was hiding. "I'm a firefighter, got lost trying to find a shortcut home." The man sneered. "Firefighter, huh? You don't look lost to me." James shrugged. "What can I say? I'm bad with directions." The enforcer stepped closer, his hand hovering near his gun. "You sure you're not snooping around where you don't belong?" Before James could respond, a crash echoed from inside the diner, followed by muffled shouting. The enforcer's head snapped toward the noise, and James seized the moment. With a swift motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it hard and forcing the gun to the ground. The enforcer grunted in pain, but James didn't let up, pinning him against the wall. "Stay down," James growled, retrieving the gun and sliding it out of reach. He grabbed the man's flashlight and tossed it to Malik, who had emerged from the shadows. "We need to move," James said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll know something's up." A risky move. Inside the diner, the tension was palpable. Through the small window, James and Malik saw Bert and the suited men arguing. One of the suits, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, was standing now, his finger jabbing at Bert. "You assured us this wouldn't be a problem," the man said, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "Now you're telling me there's heat on this place." Bert spread his hands, his expression desperate. "I've got it under control. The waitress is gone, and no one's poking around anymore." Scarface leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "If you're lying, Stevens, it won't just be your diner on the line. You know what happens to liabilities." James's fists clenched as he watched. Malik adjusted the hidden camera, capturing every word. "This is gold," Malik whispered. "We've got them dead to rights." But James wasn't convinced. "Not yet. We need to know who they're working with higher up the chain." The argument inside grew louder. One of the other suits slammed his fist on the table, silencing Bert mid-sentence. "We'll take care of the problem," the man said coldly. "But if this operation falls apart, you'll be the one answering for it." James's stomach churned. It was clear Bert was in over his head, but these men weren't the type to forgive mistakes. The stakes were higher than he'd realized. The trap is set. As the meeting wrapped up, James and Malik retreated to the safety of their car. Malik was already uploading the footage to a secure server, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. "This is enough to blow the lid off their operation," Malik said, his excitement tempered by the weight of their discovery. "We've got evidence of money laundering, intimidation, and ties to city officials. This is huge, James." James nodded, his mind still racing. "But it's not enough. We need to get their higher-ups on record. These guys are small fish in a bigger pond." Malik looked at him skeptically. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? Walk into their headquarters and ask for an interview?" "Not quite," James said, a plan already forming in his mind. "But if we play our cards right, we can bait them into revealing everything." A dangerous proposition. The next morning, James met with Maria, Danny's sister, in a small park on the outskirts of town. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Danny's still in hiding, but he wanted me to tell you something." James leaned forward. "What is it?" "There's a warehouse," Maria said, glancing around nervously. "Danny overheard them talking about it. It's where they store whatever they're moving. Drugs, money. I'm not sure, but it's important. If you can get in there, you'll find what you need." James's pulse quickened. "Where is it?" Maria hesitated, then handed him a scrap of paper with an address scrawled on it. "But please be careful. These people, they won't hesitate to kill." James nodded, pocketing the paper. "Thank you, Maria. You're doing the right thing." The warehouse raid. Later that night, James and Malik parked outside the warehouse, its looming structure casting long shadows under the dim streetlights. They weren't alone. Malik had called in a favor from a few trusted friends in law enforcement. A small team of off-duty officers was waiting in unmarked cars, ready to assist. "Everyone knows the plan?" James asked, addressing the group. The officers nodded, their expressions grim. "Good," James said. "Let's move." They approached the warehouse silently, using the darkness as cover. James signaled for the team to split up, each group covering a different entrance. As he and Malik crept toward a side door, they heard muffled voices from inside. James eased the door open, revealing a cavernous space filled with crates and pallets. Men were loading boxes into trucks, their movements hurried and efficient. At the center of the operation stood Scarface, barking orders. "Get this shipment out now," Scarface said. "We've got a narrow window before the next meeting." James motioned for the team to spread out, each officer taking a position behind the stacks of crates. They waited until everyone was in place. Then James stepped forward, his voice ringing out. "Detroit PD, put your hands where I can see them." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Men scattered, some reaching for weapons, others bolting for the exits. James and the officers moved quickly, subduing the workers and securing the area. But Scarface wasn't going down without a fight. He drew a gun, aiming it at James. "You've got no idea what you're messing with," Scarface shouted. James didn't flinch. "Drop the weapon. It's over." For a tense moment, Scarface hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Then, with a snarl, he threw the gun to the ground. As the officers handcuffed him, James turned to Malik, who was already examining the contents of the crates. "Jackpot," Malik said, holding up a file folder. "This has names, transactions, everything we need." James nodded, relief washing over him. But he knew this was only the beginning. They had taken down one piece of the operation, but the fight for justice was far from over. Peeling back the layers, the raid on the warehouse was a victory, but James knew better than to celebrate too soon. Scarface and the other captured men weren't talking, not yet. They were seasoned operatives, loyal to whoever sat at the top of the pyramid. Still, The evidence Malik found in the crates was a gold mine. Ledgers, shipping manifests, and a map of Detroit with specific neighborhoods circled in red. The team gathered at Malik's office the following day, the small space buzzing with tension. Maria joined them, her face pale but resolute, while Malik spread the documents across his cluttered desk. "This," Malik said, pointing to the ledgers, "is our smoking gun. It links urban revitalization partners to over 24 properties in Detroit, all purchased under suspicious circumstances. And this," he continued, gesturing to the map, "shows their plan. They're targeting minority-owned businesses, driving them out, and flipping the properties for massive profits." James frowned, studying the map. "And the red circles? Those are hotspots for resistance," Malik explained. "Communities that are pushing back against the gentrification. It's where they're applying the most pressure." Maria's voice was quiet but steady. "They're not just taking homes and businesses. They're taking lives. My brother Danny said they've used intimidation, arson, even violence to get what they want." The room fell silent as her words sank in. James clenched his fists, a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. "We need to take this higher," he said. "This is beyond the local precinct. We're talking about systemic corruption, and it's going to take more than just us to bring it down." Malik nodded. "I've already reached out to a federal contact. They're interested, but they'll need something irrefutable, a direct link to the people at the top." James looked at the evidence laid out before them. It was solid, but it wasn't enough to take down the big players. They needed someone on the inside, someone who could connect the dots and expose the entire operation. A dangerous proposition. James had an idea, but it was risky. He turned to Maria, who was seated quietly in the corner. "Do you know where Danny is?" Maria hesitated, then nodded. "He's in hiding, but I can get a message to him." "Why?" James leaned forward. "We need him. He's seen things we haven't. If we can convince him to come forward, his testimony could be the key to bringing this whole thing down." Maria's eyes widened in alarm. "You don't understand. If they find out he's talking to you, they'll kill him." James's voice softened. "I know it's dangerous, but we can protect him. And if we don't act now, more people are going to get hurt. Danny has the power to stop this. We just need him to trust us." Maria looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "I'll try, but I can't promise he'll agree." "That's all I'm asking," James said. The meeting. It took 2 tense days for Maria to convince Danny to meet with them. The rendezvous was set for a small church on the outskirts of the city, a place Danny felt would offer some semblance of safety. James and Malik arrived early, sweeping the area for any signs of surveillance. Satisfied that it was clear, they waited in the empty pews. Danny appeared just before dusk, his wiry frame cloaked in a dark hoodie. He looked thinner than James remembered, his face gaunt, and his eyes darting nervously. "Danny," James said, rising to greet him. "Thanks for coming." Danny didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked to Malik, then back to James. "Maria says you want to help," he said, his voice low. "But you don't know what you're up against." "Then tell us," James urged. "Help us understand. We've got evidence, but we need someone who's seen it firsthand." Danny hesitated, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Finally, he sat down in the nearest pew, his shoulders slumping. "They call themselves the Syndicate. It's not just about money. It's about control. They own half the city council, the zoning board, even some of the police. Bert's just a cog in the machine. The real power lies with the people above him." "Who are they?" Malik asked, pulling out a notepad. Danny shook his head. "I don't know all their names, but there's one guy who calls the shots. They call him the Architect. He's the one who plans everything. The buyouts, the intimidation, even the violence. I've seen him at a few meetings, but he's careful, never leaves a paper trail." James exchanged a glance with Malik. This was the piece they were missing, a direct link to the top of the organization. "Do you know where we can find him?" James asked. Danny hesitated, then nodded. "There's a meeting tomorrow night. An abandoned factory on the east side. They're bringing in some big players. If you're looking for evidence, that's where you'll find it." The factory. The abandoned factory was a monolith of rusted steel and broken windows, looming over the desolate industrial district. James, Malik, and a small team of trusted law enforcement officers approached cautiously, their movements shrouded in the cover of darkness. Inside, the factory was a labyrinth of machinery and shadowed corners. Voices echoed through the cavernous space, guiding them toward the main floor. From their vantage point on an overhead catwalk, they saw a group of men gathered around a makeshift table. At the head of the group stood a tall, imposing figure in a tailored suit. "That's him," Danny whispered, his voice trembling. "The architect." James focused his attention on the man, his every movement exuding authority. The architect spoke with a cold precision, outlining their next steps to tighten their grip on the city. James and Malik recorded every word, their hidden cameras capturing the damning evidence they needed. But as the meeting continued, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the guards stationed at the perimeter was scanning the shadows with a flashlight, and his beam was moving dangerously close to their position. "Time to go," James whispered, signaling to the team. They began their retreat, moving as quietly as possible. But just as they reached the exit, a sharp shout rang out. "Hey, up there!" The factory erupted into chaos. Guards shouted orders, and the sound of boots echoed as they gave chase. James and his team ran, weaving through the maze of machinery and debris. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, bullets ricocheting off metal beams. "Keep moving," James shouted, leading the group toward a side door. They burst into the night, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Malik clutched his laptop, the files they had recorded safely stored on its hard drive. But they weren't out of danger yet. Vehicles roared to life in the distance, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "Split up," James ordered. "Regroup at the safe house." As the group scattered, James stayed close to Malik, guiding him through the maze of alleyways. The vehicles closed in, their engines roaring. James's mind raced, his determination unshaken. They had what they needed. Now, it was a race against time to make it count. The final stand. The safe house was an unassuming brick building tucked away in a quiet Detroit neighborhood. It had been used before by Malik's contacts for undercover operations, a perfect hideout, at least for now. James and Malik arrived just before dawn, their adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Inside, Maria and Danny were waiting, their faces pale with worry. "Did you get it?" Maria asked, rushing to meet them. James nodded, his expression grim. "We got everything. But they know someone was there. It's only a matter of time before they come looking." Malik set his laptop on the dining table, pulling up the footage they had captured at the factory. The group crowded around as the screen lit up with the meeting's recording. The architect's face filled the frame, his cold, calculating voice outlining their plans to tighten their grip on the city. Names were mentioned, payments were discussed, and the full scale of the corruption came into view. "This is it," Malik said, leaning back in his chair. "This ties the entire operation together. We've got the architect, the syndicate structure, and their connection to local officials." Maria's eyes filled with tears. This is what Danny's been risking his life for. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And now it's our turn to finish the job." Mobilizing the truth. The evidence was too explosive to keep under wraps. Malik reached out to his contact at a national news network, a trusted journalist named Rebecca Hayes. Within hours, Rebecca and her team arrived at the safe house, bringing with them an army of cameras, reporters, and legal experts. Rebecca was a seasoned journalist with a reputation for taking down powerful figures. She studied the evidence with laser focus, her expression growing grimmer with each passing minute. "This is a bombshell," Rebecca said finally. "But if we're going to air this, we need to do it right. We need corroboration, documentation, and an airtight story. If even one piece of this falls apart, they'll discredit the entire thing." James nodded. "We've got everything you need, but we need to act fast. The syndicate knows we're coming for them." Rebecca wasted no time. She began coordinating with her team to prepare the story for broadcast. Meanwhile, Malik worked with James to secure additional copies of the evidence, ensuring it couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. Danny provided a recorded testimony, detailing everything he had witnessed. His words were raw and emotional, a stark reminder of the human cost of the syndicate's greed. The syndicate strikes back. As the team worked, the safe house became a hive of activity. But the calm didn't last. That evening, a black SUV parked across the street, its tinted windows hiding the occupants inside. James noticed it first, his firefighter instincts alerting him to the danger. "We've been made," James said, pulling Malik and Rebecca aside. "They're watching us." Rebecca's expression hardened. "We're too close to stop now. We need to go live as soon as possible." Malik nodded. "I can set up a secure connection and stream directly to the network. If they're trying to silence us, we need to make sure the truth gets out before they can." As they hurried to prepare the broadcast, the tension in the room grew. Outside, the SUV remained parked, its occupants unmoving. James kept a close watch, his hand resting on the concealed weapon he had taken from Bert's enforcer days earlier. The broadcast. At precisely 9:00 p.m., the broadcast went live. Rebecca sat in front of a camera, her voice steady as she introduced the story. The footage from the factory played on screen, followed by Danny's testimony and the documentation Malik had uncovered. The report was a damning indictment of the syndicate, naming names and exposing their web of corruption. As the broadcast aired, the response was immediate. Social media had exploded with outrage, and calls flooded into city officials demanding action. James could feel the momentum shifting, but he knew the syndicate wouldn't go down without a fight. The assault. The first shot shattered the front window of the safe house, sending everyone scrambling for cover. James grabbed Malik, pulling him behind the heavy oak dining table as bullets tore through the walls. "They're coming in hot," James shouted. Everyone stay down. The SUV across the street had disgorged its occupants, armed men in tactical gear who moved with military precision. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to eliminate. James took charge, barking orders as the group fortified their position. Rebecca's team, though shaken, followed his lead, using whatever they could to block the windows and reinforce the doors. "They'll breach the doors soon," Malik said, his voice tight with fear. "Not if I stop them first," James replied, grabbing the handgun he had stashed earlier. "Stay low." James moved through the house with practiced ease, his firefighter training kicking in. He reached the back door just as one of the assailants began forcing it open. Without hesitation, James swung the door wide and disarmed the man with a swift blow to the wrist. A second attacker lunged at him, but James used the momentum to send him crashing into a nearby wall. Gunfire continued to erupt outside, but James refused to back down. He pressed forward, using the shadows and chaos to his advantage. His sole focus was protecting the people inside. The syndicate's downfall. The siege lasted nearly an hour, but the sound of approaching sirens signaled a turning point. The syndicate's men, realizing they were out of time, began to retreat. James and the others held their ground until the police arrived, their presence finally forcing the attackers to flee. As the dust settled, James surveyed the damage. The safe house was in shambles, but everyone inside was alive. Rebecca's broadcast had continued uninterrupted, her team streaming from a hidden backup server. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Aftermath. In the days that followed, the fallout was immense. Arrests swept through the city as law enforcement and federal agents dismantled the syndicate's network. Bert, Scarface, and even the architect were taken into custody, their empire crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Rebecca's report became a national sensation, shining a light on the corruption that had plagued Detroit for years. Maria and Danny, though still cautious, finally felt a sense of hope for the future. James, Malik, and Rebecca were hailed as heroes, though James shied away from the spotlight. For him, the victory wasn't about recognition, it was about justice. A quiet moment. One evening, James returned to Bella's Cafe, now under new ownership. The neon sign buzzed faintly, but the atmosphere inside was warm and welcoming. Maggie, the waitress who had been at the center of it all, greeted him with a smile. "Good to see you, James," she said. "What'll it be?" James smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "The house special," he said. "And this time, make it extra strong." As he sat by the window, sipping his coffee, James allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be won, injustices to be righted. But for now, he was content to savor the small victories. Detroit had weathered the storm, and though the scars remained, the city was beginning to heal. And James, ever the quiet hero, was ready for whatever came next. Justice and redemption. The morning after the siege, the city woke to a tidal wave of breaking news. The syndicate's takedown dominated every headline, from local papers to national broadcasts. Images of the architect being led away in handcuffs flooded the media, a symbol of the corruption that had gripped Detroit finally coming to light. For many, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. At the hospital, James sat at Maria's bedside, where Danny had been recovering from the emotional toll and wounds of his ordeal. His sister sat close, holding his hand tightly. Though Danny's face was pale and his body still weak, there was a quiet strength in his gaze. "You did it," Danny whispered, his voice hoarse but resolute. "You brought them down." James nodded, leaning forward. "We all did it. Your bravery made it possible." Maria, who had been silently watching, spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "Danny, I've never been prouder of you. This fight wasn't just for us. It was for every family they hurt." James reached out, placing a hand on Danny's shoulder. "You've given this city something it hasn't had in a long time. Hope. And now it's up to all of us to make sure we don't lose it." Rebuilding trust. Over the following weeks, the aftermath of the syndicate's fall rippled across Detroit. Community leaders, once silenced by fear, began to speak out, rallying their neighborhoods to rebuild what had been lost. City officials connected to the corruption scandal were removed from office, replaced by activists and reformers who vowed to restore integrity to the city's governance. James and Malik stayed involved, working behind the scenes to support community initiatives. Malik's investigative skills proved invaluable in tracing the syndicate's remaining assets, which were seized and redistributed to fund public programs and reparations for affected families. Bella's Cafe reopened under new ownership, a cooperative run by local residents. Maggie returned as one of its managers, her warm smile a constant reminder of the diner's transformation from a place of exclusion to one of inclusivity and hope. A personal reckoning. One evening, James found himself standing outside the ruins of the abandoned factory, where the syndicate's final meeting had taken place. The site was cordoned off, slated for demolition, but James couldn't help but linger. This place had been a battleground, not just of fists and bullets, but of ideals. It was where justice had finally found its footing. Malik arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to James with a wry grin. "Figured you'd be here." James took the cup, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Couldn't stay away. Feels like we left something behind." Malik nodded, staring at the crumbling structure. "We left a lot behind, James, but we also took back more than they ever expected." James sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. "You think we made a difference?" Malik clapped him on the shoulder. "Look around. The city's talking about change, James. Not just words, real change. And that's because of you." James shook his head. "Not just me. You, Danny, Maria, Rebecca. Everyone who stood up when it mattered. That's what made the difference. A quiet farewell. As Detroit began to heal, James felt a growing pull to return to his roots. The firehouse, his home for over a decade, was where he had learned the value of service and sacrifice. One crisp morning, he walked through its familiar doors, greeted by the warm camaraderie of his fellow firefighters. "Welcome back, James," his captain said, clapping him on the back. "We kept your gear ready." James smiled. "I never doubted you." Later that day, as James helped prepare the fire truck for a routine inspection, he caught a glimpse of himself in the polished chrome of the engine. For the first time in years, he saw not just a firefighter, but a man at peace with his choices, a man who had faced darkness and refused to let it win. The future of Detroit. Months later, at a community rally held in one of the neighborhoods the syndicate had once targeted, James stood quietly at the back of the crowd. He listened as Maria spoke, her voice strong and clear as she urged her neighbors to unite against injustice. "We are the city," she said, her words resonating. "We are its heartbeat, its strength, its soul. Together, we can rebuild not just buildings, but trust. Together, we can make Detroit whole again." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. James felt a swell of pride as he watched Maria and Danny, now both advocates for justice, leading the charge for change. As the rally dispersed, Malik appeared beside him, grinning. "You could have been up there, you know." James chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm better back here. Besides, they've got it covered." Malik nodded, his expression softening. "You know, James, not all heroes wear capes." James smirked. "Some of us just wear fireproof suits." Epilogue. In the end, the syndicate's downfall was more than a victory for justice. It was a testament to the power of community, resilience, and courage. Detroit wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would be long and challenging. But for the first time in years, its people felt a spark of hope. And for James Parker, that was enough.